Catalunya, Past, Present and Future by Geoff Cowling, Her Majesty's former Consul General. A 60-minute talk from the Ageas Salisbury International Arts Festival 2013. Geoff Cowling was Her Majesty's Consul General in Barcelona between 2002 and 2005, and he explores Catalunya's history and reflects on its future. To follow this on Twitter, use #SalisburyFestival.
Thank you very much indeed for coming and sparing your time. And I should like to say thanks very much indeed to the Salisbury Festival and indeed to the Catalan delegation who simply said, would I come along and give a little bit of a chat about Catalunya, and this seems to have grown into something which is rather bigger than I expected. I should also like to say thank you to the Institute Ramon Llull, which is the British Council equivalent in Catalunya, responsible for their cultural promotions, and from what I can see from the programme, doing a jolly good job. I've been asked to speak about the past, the present and the future. Now, Catalunya's past goes back a long way. The flag here on my left is probably one of the oldest in Europe. It's called the Senyera, and it goes back to the siege of Barcelona in 897, when Barcelona was sieged by a fellow called Lomo bin Muhammad of Lerida, because at that time, of course, the Muslim Empire was extending across North Africa and had taken most of Spain at that time. But nonetheless, they didn't quite get as far as Barcelona, but they did in Lerida. Let me just put on a map of Catalunya so you can hopefully see what we're talking about. Barcelona is there, and Lerida is over here, except it's in Catalan, so it's called Lleida. Now, this flag, the history of it is that in this battle, the Count of Barcelona won Guifré el Pelos, that means Wilfrid the Hairy, that's the best way to describe it, was mortally wounded, and he was allied with a French king called Charles the Bald. Now, you can barely make this up. And he, on seeing that Guifré el Pelos was mortally wounded, he grabbed his 4 fingers through his mortal wounds and spread them across his golden shield, and that is how the Senyera came to pass. Other historians actually say that Charles the Bald died 20 years before, but frankly, don't let the facts get in the way of a really good story. I remember at one time, when I was Consul General in Barcelona, I went and called on the head of the Esquerra Republicana de Catalunya, which is the left-wing independent party, a fellow called Josep Luis Rovira. I'll come back to him later. And we were discussing the whole concept about Catalunya and its history. And Catalans are really deeply Catalan. I mean, I have met some who will say, Catalan is in my blood, Catalan is my culture, my language is Catalan, but I have to carry a Spanish passport. It's very deep. Now, Josep Luis said to me, this is our history, this is steeped into 1,000 years of Catalunya's history. But in Madrid, you'll always see this battle going on between Madrid and Barcelona. Their flag was just chosen by a public competition. Catalunya too has the oldest parliament in Europe, although there's some debate as to whether that competes with the Icelandic one as well. And it's called the Salon de Cens, which is just opposite the Palau de la Generalitat, the main presidential palace, as it were, in the Plaza de Sant Jaume in the heart of Barcelona. And the Palau de la Generalitat was reputed to have been built by funds from the burghers of Perpignan up there. I should say that my daughter was married in the Salon de Cens in a ceremony in Catalan presided over by Joan Clos, who was the mayor of Barcelona at the time. Now, Catalunya was part of the Crown of Aragon, which included this area of Languedoc-Roussillon going up as far as Perpignan, and also, though it's not on the map, Aragon itself. Now, in flukes of history, there were probably at least two times, there was a short time in the 12th century when the Catalunya, if you include that as the Crown of Aragon, and England, if you include its French possessions, actually shared a common border. Henry II of England was married, of course, to Eleanor of Aquitaine, and the possessions of Aquitaine went down as far as the Crown of Aragon. And you could say that probably the same thing happened after 1415, when Henry V defeated the King of France at Agincourt in the 100 Years' War. But probably our links, culturally and politically, and I'm talking about England, not Scotland, because Scotland, wasn't part of anything until James VI came into being. But our links were probably quite strong politically during all that time, because you may, of course, recall that Henry VIII, his first wife, was Catherine of Aragon, although she was in fact born in Alcalá de Henares outside Madrid. But nonetheless, this was the degree of political weight which was put to marital unions of that time. And you could say that Catherine of Aragon actually changed our history forever, because just imagine what would have happened, or what possibly might have happened, if at the point of conception her daughter, Mary, actually was a boy. We may never have left the Catholic Church. We would have gone on an entirely different route, and I'm sure we wouldn't all be sitting here. So yes, Catalunya's had an enormous influence over us at one time or another. I'm going to leap over a whole period of history to the next time that we really collided, which was in the Wars of the Spanish Succession, which dragged on from 1701 until the Treaty of Utrecht in 1714, where we still have a remnant of that in the form of Gibraltar. And in this war, England changed sides, and because we ceased supporting the Austrian candidate over the French to succeed Charles II of Spain, when the Austrian candidate himself became Emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the idea was that we would never want to support something so incredibly large. Now, the Catalans had actually allied with us and given us their unconditional support in the 1704 Treaty of Geneva against the Spanish and the French. The fact that we changed sides, we effectively deserted them and left Catalonia to its fate, and it was taken back under Spanish control, and there was a one-year siege of Barcelona by French and Spanish forces, and Barcelona fell on the 11th of September in 1714. That's when they lost their independence, and they lost a constitution which had gone back to the 15th century. Now, why do I mention all of this? Because it is important. Next year is the 300th anniversary of that loss, and the sentiment features very deeply in today's politics. We're going to jump a bit now to the Spanish Civil War, because we all have heard of George Orwell's Homage to Catalunya and his experiences in that very divisive war, which eventually, of course, led to Animal Farm in 1984. I mention this because one of the biggest battles of the Spanish Civil War, was fought in the Ebro River area here. And there was an offensive by the Republicans to stop the forces of Franco, who were well supported by Italy and Germany at the time. Well, really Hitler and Mussolini, let's say. And they were beaten back at that particular point. That battle was large in the sense that something like 250,000 people took part and 50,000 died. I got involved in that because right at the, not in the battle, but in the commemorative thing side, in my last couple of months as Consul General, I retired in 2005, there was an event put on by a fellow called David Leach, who had done a marvellous film called Voices from a Mountain about international brigaders who had fought in that conflict. And he was unveiling a memorial on Hill 705, which is in the Sierra de Pandols, which is just south of Gandesa. And I thought I would go along and speak at this, and it turned out that I was the first British diplomat ever to speak at an event involving the International Brigade. I should say I'm not the last, because Dame Denise Holt, the British ambassador in Madrid, did so a few years afterwards. And there were a remarkable bunch there. They're all very, very left-wing, but one of them included Jack Jones, who was the trade union leader. And in my speech, I tried to draw the Second World War and the Spanish Civil War together by pointing out that at one particular time in the Battle of the Ebro, there was something like 300 aircraft in the sky at any one time, at one particular time. And these would have included pilots like Molders, Aldolf Gallen, etc., who were gaining the experience in the use of the Messerschmitt 109 over the skies of the Ebro, over the skies of Catalunya, which were then replicated over these skies here in the Battle of Britain, over Kent, Sussex, Surrey, Hampshire, etc., Wiltshire. So there is a very, very strong link in my mind. And during the Spanish Civil War, of course, Picasso's picture, his painting of Guernica, is probably one of the most iconic paintings of the last century. And it obviously depicted the appalling raid by the Condor Legion on Guernica, which was the capital of the Basque Country. Very interesting, I say the Basque Country, because this was a way of subduing Basque nationalism. Because at the same time, later in March 1938, it is little known that in raids on Barcelona by the Italian Air Force, some 2,700 civilians died. The Italians operated out of the Balearic Islands. Now, this was a greater number than were killed by the German Condor Legion at Guernica. As the Republic was defeated and Franco's forces began to get further into Catalunya, then the president at that time, Luis Companys, was forced to flee, and he fled into France. Luis Companys was later extradited from the German-occupied France. He was tried by Franco and then shot at Montjuic Castle, which overlooks Barcelona. Now, this too is highly symbolic, because he was executed in a castle which was used during that siege of Barcelona to bomb Barcelona, to bombard it. And Luis Companys remains the only incumbent British president in Europe to have been executed. And he was executed in the moat of the dried moat of the of Montjuic. I did actually stand at the post where he was, and was reminded that he asked to face the firing squad, not blindfolded and with no shoes, because he wanted to feel the last thing he wanted to feel was the soil of Catalunya on his feet. And incidentally, he is now buried in a place called La Pedrera, which is a quarry at the back of Montjuic. If you ever go there, it's really worth looking at, because there are monuments there with the names of many, many people who were shot in the repression that took place after Franco's defeat of the Spanish Republic. There was a tomb to Luis Companys there, but also, and rather upsettingly in some ways, right against the bottom of the cliff, there are lots of individual memorials, and I can only assume that people were shot on the top of the quarry and their bodies were simply thrown in. For the living, you may or may not know something called the Retirada, because in January 1939, up to 500,000 refugees, that's 500,000, from the Spanish Civil War, crossed the Catalan border into France. And they were they went over a whole series of, a whole series of crossing points. I, in fact, a few years ago, took some time off and I drove across all the crossing points here, and I found it quite remarkable that there are signs now going up, little memorials saying, put up in 2009, this is an incredible thing. It's taken all of this time for people to remember, and they will say 30,000 refugees crossed this point, 100,000 crossed here, etc., etc. And part of Catalunya's own history is being recovered. There was a law passed in 2007 called La Ley para la Recuperación de la Memoria Histórica by the Spanish government, and Catalunya was the only one of the 17 autonomous communities of Spain to have a government department called Memorial Democratic, which has done a fantastic job, not only just writing the history of this point, funding various things, but also rather more controversially funding the opening of mass graves and through DNA, etc., trying to find out who was in them. But going back to these refugees, obviously a huge influx of refugees into that part of France was a great shock to the French at that time, and they had no real way of dealing with them. The result is that many were treated absolutely appallingly. They were herded into makeshift camps, some at Ageas, which is just up there. They simply threw barbed wire around the beach, and so they couldn't escape from the sea, and they were kept in there, and many thousands died in those conditions. About 100,000 actually did return to Spain, and of course their future was then very much uncertain. Things really started to hot up once the Germans declared war on France, and of course later took over all of the area of Vichy France, which included Languedoc-Roussillon, etc., along there. And some 10,000 refugees were taken to Mauthausen, where all but about 1,500 died. Many were forced into forced labour. There are Spanish Republicans who actually lie on British soil in the Channel Islands, where they died constructing Hitler's infamous Atlantic Wall. Interestingly, the fighting men, because a lot of the Spanish army at that particular time, Republicans, retreated into Spain, some of them in quite good order, and came over with tanks, rifles, weapons, etc. And once war started to be obvious, or it had developed, many were recruited into the French Foreign Legion. You may see references to Spanish battalions. They are usually those who came across the border at that particular time, and indeed further over to the west in the Basque Country, Iparralde and Egualde, the two parts of the Basque Country, one's in France, the other one's in Spain. A number, it is not generally known, made it to the UK, and they were, as part of the Free French forces, a lot of the French army, you may recall, after being evacuated from Dunkirk, actually volunteered to go back where they were made prisoners, and didn't stay in the UK. But these, of course, were between a brick and a hard place and could do nothing. And they were recruited into the British Army and served as commandos in Narvik and in Crete and in North Africa. And those that were in the Free French forces formed the backbone of Leclerc's 2nd Armoured Division when he liberated Paris in August 1944. And their tanks, you can see photographs of them, bear the names like Ebro, Teruel, Belchite, Madrid, Guadalajara, the battles of the Spanish Civil War. Being tankmen, they were then moved on, and many of them took part in the siege of Strasbourg, which took place later, and many of them died. Few survived. But this group of Spanish Republicans in that area, and also over to the west, provided a very fertile ground for the British Secret Services as well. And MI9, which was the organisation set up by the British to aid the escape of prisoners, either from pre-OW camps, or the vast majority were downed airmen who evaded capture. And there was a few soldiers as well who managed to evade capture after Dunkirk. MI9 recruited a number of Spanish Republican guides to bring people over into what was then neutral Spain, effectively. Now, they're a pretty disparate bunch. I mean, frankly, the Secret Services, if you want to break into a safe, the best thing to do is to employ a criminal safe breaker, because he's quite good at it. In the case of the guides, then why not take a smuggler or someone who really is on the wrong side of the law and knows the routes across. And MI9, certainly over in the Basque Country, one of the most famous guides was a fellow called Florentino Goicoechea, who was Basque. And he was employed by MI9 to bring people down what is called the Comet Line. MI9 recruited on the Catalan side some quite interesting guys, including a fellow called Francisco Poznan Vidal, who was actually a Spanish anarchist. And what he wanted to do was anything against Franco. He wasn't actually that fond of the British, but nonetheless, he worked for us and we armed him. Now, his group was responsible for bringing over the 2 survivors of the Cockershell Heroes raid, Major Hasler and Marine Sparks. And there is very strong evidence that he also brought over Airy Neve, who escaped from Colditz, and he was taken down to the Consulate General in Barcelona, which was my office. Actually, it wasn't. I got a new office at that time, but I did serve there in 1970 in the office into which he would have been brought. Remarkably, Francisco Poznan Vidal was given a citation by King George VI in 1948. Now, I don't think that's bad for a Catalan anarchist. He's probably revolving in his grave. He was, in fact, taken out and shot by the Germans in a mass shooting, which they did a lot of shooting after the liberation when they were moving out, and he was killed in 1948. He'd been captured a little while before, and he was shot with a group of about 50, herded into a building, which was then machine gunned and caught fire. Now, for all of that, I can honestly recommend, if you're still around on Friday, do come along to Edward Sturton's presentation here of his book of The Cruel Crossing. Now, for reasons best known to himself, he's asked me to interview him on this, partly because I am also the chairman of something called the Escape Lines Memorial Society, which our way of commemorating these routes, these escape routes, is actually to walk them. Edward Sturton walked with us 2 years ago. I've done this walk 8 times now, and it's one of the more difficult ones. We go from a place just north of up here, a place called Saint-Giron in the Ageas, and it's 4 days taking everything with you, tent, food. We cross 3 8,500 foot passes, and we end up in Esteli de New here, where most of the escapers and invaders were surrendered themselves and kept in a prison there in Soult before going down to either Lerida or Girona prisons, and then they were taken out. Often they spent time in the concentration camp at Miranda del Ebro. The other person who is really worth noting is a fellow called Jawan Pujol, who had, we called him Garbo. He was a double agent, and the Germans called him Unavailable. He was a Catalan chicken farmer. His story is a long one, but if you get his, I suggest reading the biography by Nigel West to know the details, but basically he was recruited by the British Secret Services. He ran the most incredible fictitious network of spies in Britain, sending back information to the Germans. It was so good and so persuasive. If you may remember, in this particular area, obviously the invasion force went from here, but they had phantom armies in Kent of blown-up tanks, mock aircraft, etc., to persuade the Germans that the attack was actually going to come across the Pas-de-Calais and not Normandy. Jawan Pujol masterminded all of that. And Eisenhower, after the war, said that if that had been unsuccessful and that the German armoured divisions, which were kept in Calais until September, remember the D-Day was in June, they were kept there in September because the Germans were still convinced that the main thrust was going to come across the Pas-de-Calais and that Normandy was a diversion. If those tanks had been taken out and thrown straight into the battle in Normandy, it is quite probable that D-Day would have failed. Now that's, for that huge debt, we eventually awarded Jawan Pujol an MBE, which is, you actually get that for doing school crossings after a while, but rather shame. But actually he masterminded his own disappearance and was discovered by Nigel West in Venezuela, and he was given this award in the the SOE Club, Special Operations Executive Club in Knightsbridge. I have been there. It's just one of these sort of holes in it, well, just a door in it. It just looks like a house, but it isn't. And the Duke of Edinburgh gave that to him, I think, in 1964, but I may well be wrong. Now, I also find it interesting that Churchill, in his finest hour speech, if you actually look at his finest hour speech, it's a very, very long speech. It was a speech to Parliament on the 18th of June 1940, so only a matter of days, I beg your pardon. In his finest hour speech in 1940, this was before the Battle of Britain, he said, "I do not underrate the ordeal which lies before us, but I believe our countrymen will show themselves capable of standing up to it, like the brave people of Barcelona." That is going back to that air raid that I mentioned. I find it odd that Churchill should have referred to the suffering in Barcelona in the Spanish Civil War 2 years before, and not the more recent devastation in the Second World War, Warsaw and Rotterdam. Some also point to Churchill's House of Commons speech of the 24th of May 1944, just before D-Day, thanking for Spain for staying out of the war. Some of those far more sympathetic to Franco than perhaps I am say this shows that Churchill supported him. It was an acknowledgement of Franco's help to the Allies for staying out of the war. I would argue that Spain's entry into the war on the side of the Axis would have denied the Allies the Mediterranean, because we'd have lost Gibraltar, and would have threatened our supply lines to Africa, the Far East, and also to Latin America and North America, because those islands, like the Canaries, would have been open to U-boat bases, and they would have virtually shut off the South Atlantic and ranged far more into the North Atlantic. So it was absolutely essential to keep Spain out of the war, and I believe that knowing that that D-Day was coming, that speech was designed, because he mentions Turkey, he mentions a whole number of countries, just to placate and steady everybody for the storm which he knew was going to come. Interestingly, after eventually D-Day and the liberation, I should mention actually that the Spanish Mckee in the areas in which we walked was in what we do today, and I'm learning more and more about this as time goes on, was far more active than I had thought. I've learnt, and it's mentioned by a whole chapter, because I discussed it with Edward Sturton, and he mentions it in his book, about the atrocities of a certain town called Remont, which is now near Saint-Giron, where we start. And that was probably in reprisal to activities of the Spanish Mckee, who acted separately from the French. They coordinated from time to time, but mainly they kept to themselves in the hills. Whether they were supplied directly by SOE and the, not MI9, it would be SIS and SOE is open to some question, I think. Certainly they would have acquired arms, because sometimes when our aircraft came over dropping supplies, there was a hell of a race to get to them, and they would certainly acquired a number. And I remember going with our representative, Scott Goodall, up there to a place called the Col de Ril, which was a perfect ambush spot, where the Spanish Mckee, there's a small memorial there, the Spanish Mckee took out a German column. In reprisal, the Germans the next day, or a couple of days later, went to a village called Remont, burned it, slaughtered those inhabitants who didn't get away, and raped the women who were there, and burnt the place to the ground. It's one of these martyr villages, which I'm afraid are part of the French landscape in their area. But very interestingly, the Germans were not Germans. They were what the French called then, those that I've spoken to called the Mongols. They were regiments recruited from that part of the Soviet Union in the Caucasus, who didn't like Stalin very much, and therefore found themselves to be a rich recruiting ground for the Germans. And I think it was something called the Turkmenistan Regiment. It was part of Das Reich. But I just mention that because there's this idea that it was the French versus the Germans. But in fact, the fight that was going on there was between Spanish Mckee and Muslim troops from that part of Asia. In November 1944, when it was clear that the Germans were losing, the Spanish Mckee actually attempted an invasion. In the Val d'Aran, which is over here. And they came over in some hundreds to Vieja, naively thinking that with fascism being defeated in Europe, that the Allies would then follow and would support them in toppling Franco. It didn't actually happen. And I remember I was at an event in Barcelona at which the Spanish Civil War was discussed, and I was on a panel and I said something, and somebody got up from the audience and said, "How dare a representative of the Allies talk about the Spanish Civil War, Allies who stopped their tanks on the frontiers of Spain and left us to fester under Franco's fascism for another 30 years. I have to say I was rather humbled at that particular point. But it does demonstrate how, again, deep this feeling is. And during that period of Franco in Catalunya and the Basque Country in particular, because they had separate, and I was maintained, they still had separate identities culturally, linguistically, then there was a considerable repression against Catalanism within Catalunya. The publication of the language was forbidden. You couldn't broadcast in it. A good friend of mine in Catalunya told me that walking down the street talking to her brother, she turned the corner. This was during Franco's time, and there was a Guardia Civil, the guy with the three-cornered hat, telling them to stop speaking Catalan and to speak not Spanish, not Castellano, but to speak Christian, because the Catalans regarded as the Antichrist, etc. And there was very little reference to World War II in school history. The basic line was that Franco kept Spain out of the World War II and saved Spain from Bolshevism. I remember in 2005, before I left, I organised a walk down in the Pandols in the Battle of the Ebro area, which I had done quite a lot of exploring around and got to know some historians there who helped me organise a walk. And we had something like 50 members of the British community who came down, who were very interested in doing this. They're actually called the Witty Walkers, and they still do monthly walks all over Catalunya. I've been to one already this year. And I remember showing around in the Battle of the Ebro area and visiting a place called Pedrera, which is a ruined town, left as it was. And there was a Catalan woman there. It's a very Anglo-Catalan thing. Most of the Brits there have got Catalan partners, so it's a very integrated group. And this woman came up to me and in tears saying that we were told nothing of this during our history at school. And also I remember taking another elderly person around there in roughly the same time, yes, it was certainly before I left, but also said, why am I being shown my history by an Englishman? I felt actually a bit invasive into this, but because you were touching a very, very deep core. He later called me his cicerone, his guide, which I thought was very touching. Franco died in 1975, and then there was a period of transition. And if the European Court of in The Hague had existed at that time, it would have been full. It would have been full of people on both sides, because there were tremendous atrocities in the early stages by the anarchists when the Republicans lost control of churchmen, desecration of church, murders of priests, etc. It would have been full. Now the Spanish decided that they would have something called the Pact of Oblivion, that we will regard this as an era of collective madness and move on. It's still a period, a very controversial act. I often wonder if we'd had a civil war, how we would actually deal with it. And maybe, just maybe, that's not a bad idea. But a lot of people got away, quite literally, with murder. This led, of course, to the 1978 Constitution for Spain. Now that's based on, and I quote, the indissoluble unity of the Spanish nation, the common and indivisible homeland of all Spaniards. It also recognises and guarantees the right to self-government of the nationalities and regions of which it is composed, and the solidarity amongst them all. Now the ultimate defender of the Constitution is the Spanish Defence Force. That led to the first elections in Spain for 45 years, and they were in 1980. Now that's not long ago. So in dealing with the situation of today, I think you have to recognise that the roots of democracy in Spain are not really that deep. Now the Constitution formed 17 autonomous communities, of which Catalunya is only just one. But in terms of economic weight, contributing something like 20 to 25% of Spain's GDP, it is huge compared, and I now start to introduce Scotland, say Scotland's contribution to the UK's GDP. The Constitution also meant the restoration of the Catalan Parliament, and at that time a renowned Catalan politician, Jawan Pujol, was elected president, and that was a post he held for 23 years. And then he handed over the leadership of his party, which is called Convergencia, but there's also Convergencia y Unión, CIU, or CIU as they call it. He handed over the presidency of that, of the party anyway, to Artur Mas, who is president of Catalunya today. Now, all the political parties in Catalunya are not really found elsewhere in the rest of Spain. They even have different names, although they might represent the same thing. So I've mentioned Convergencia y Unión. There's the PSC, which is the Partido Socialista de Catalunya, which is not quite the same as PSOE, which is the main Spanish Catalan Socialist Party. Whereas, as I mentioned, Esquerra Republicana de Catalunya, of which, as I mentioned, Josep Corredera was president during my time. Even the PP, which was the Partido Popular, which is in government now in Madrid, that even so is called PPC, it's the Partido Popular de Catalunya. And there's another party called Iniciativa en Verde, which is a sort of an odd coalition of Initiativa, which really is another rebranding of communists, and Verde, which is the Green Party. Now, well, you like to put those two together, but that's the way it is there. We come now to the present, because there is an independence debate. I would suggest that this was really begun in 2005, yes, when after elections then, and Convergencia for the first time in years was thrown out. And there was, well, it wasn't really thrown out. What it was, they couldn't get a majority in Parliament. And there was something called the Tripartite, which was an alliance of the Partido Socialista de Catalunya, Esquerra Republicana, and Iniciativa came together to form a tripartite, which actually lasted a remarkably long time. And the vice president, vice-president, was José Luis Cadero Rovira. And he, at that stage, began to call for an independence referendum on the 11th of September next year, being the 300th anniversary of the fall of Barcelona. Now, this, of course, had shades of the SNP's wish to capitalise on next year's 700th anniversary of Robert the Bruce's victory over Edward II's forces at the Battle of Bannockburn. So we're beginning to come together here. Now, as Vice-President, Cadero Rovira established delegations overseas, obviously not embassies, but in London, and we have Josep Suarez, who's the Catalan delegate here today, in Paris, Berlin, and New York. Barcelona also benefits, as I was Consul General, the British Consul General, but it has the largest collection of consular posts in a non-state capital, apart from New York and Hong Kong, although I think somebody's now mentioned Shanghai. And it also established Catalan observatories, and these are at a sort of an academic level. And there's a Catalan observatory in the LSE, there's one in Stanford University in California, etc. So Catalunya has raised its profile. I would say that there are calls at the moment from the PP in Madrid for Catalunya to close these. Now, going back a little bit, following a referendum in 2006, now I mean sort of not in my home territory because I left in 2005, Catalunya adopted a statute of autonomy, always referred to as a statute, which gave Catalunya greater powers. Now, this was not only passed by the Catalan government, as you would expect, but it was also passed by the Spanish Cortes and signed off by the king. But the statute was challenged in 2010 by Spain's Constitutional Court, and this denied Catalunya's status as a nation. And in July 2010, over 1 million demonstrators in Barcelona marched through the city with banners and shouting, "Som una nación, los altres decidim." We are a nation, we decide. So you can see this friction going on. There's always been friction. In fact, the main friction, of course, manifested itself every time Barcelona played Madrid. And that was an outlet for political tension. And incidentally, the Catalans will claim that Spain's World Cup win was almost solely as a result of the contribution of the Catalan players in the Spanish national team. So they won the World Cup. But of course, this is on a more practical level. There are conflicts over tax raising and spending. Use of language in the schools. If you go to a school in Catalunya, you're taught in Catalan, not simply taught Catalan, you taught mathematics or geography, it's history. It is in Catalan, sciences. Spanish is actually being relegated to the same level as English to be taught as a foreign language. Now that really has aggravated people in Madrid. There are also, of course, and there are also religious issues too, because the religious studies in Catalonia are sort of like learning about religions, but Madrid has just insisted that you've actually got to talk exactly what Catholicism is about. But of course you've got a dire economic situation, which is really aggravating that at the moment. We complain about our unemployment at 9%. In Spain it's 25%. For youth, no it's not, it's 27%, it's gone up 2%. For the 18 to 25-year-olds, it's over 50%. Quite why there's not more civil disturbance, I don't know. But it's partly because families tend to look after each other, and there is quite a degree of black economy work. Now again, all of this friction came to a head only a few months ago in September 2012. They always have a march on that La Diada day. It's called La Diada. It was the day that Barcelona fell. I was there. It was absolutely astonishing. There were, according to the police, now the police tend to sort of underestimate, or perhaps they give the true one, it's the organisers who tend to underestimate. But the police said there were 1.5 million people on the streets of Barcelona, mainly in the Paseo de Gracia going to Plaza Catalunya. I was there. They said it was a march. It wasn't actually. It was a solid mass of people. Extremely peaceful. Families shunting along with a pushchair. I thought, this could be a disaster if it actually went wrong. It didn't. It was a very peaceful demonstration. But everybody was shouting for independence, and they were either waving the Señera, or as a new flag has developed over here, and it's called the Estelada, because it's got a star on it, and that is becoming more and more recognised as the Catalan flag for independence. Now, Josep, you told me that when you bought it for me, for which many thanks, the guy who sold it to you said, "Do you want the old flag or the new?" It's that sort of recognised. Now this actually caused the government to bring forward the elections in response. So what you've got is a movement that's taking place from the grassroots upwards. It's affecting government. Now I think that Artur Mas, when he called these elections, thought that Convergencia de Union were going to benefit from this. In fact, they lost seats through Esquerra Republicana. But the plain fact is that within the Catalan Parliament, the majority of parties, the majority of representatives are in favour of a referendum of sorts on Catalonia's future as an independent country. This is rather, in my view, ground to a bit of a halt, because in face of the constitutional objectives from Madrid. Now, early last month, I was asked by the Institute of Autonomous Studies in Barcelona, I beg your pardon, to give a paper on the differences between the Scottish and the Catalunya situation. That's it here. I actually managed to put it all together in Catalan and delivered it in Catalan. Bit of a strain, but anyway, we did it. My main points there were, because Catalans cannot understand, how is it in Britain that Alex Salmond decides that he wants to have a referendum for Scotland, and David Cameron, who's from the Conservatives, and therefore, as far as they're concerned, very much more like the PP, says, yes, go ahead and do it. How is that possible? Well, the answer is, yes, we have a constitution, but it's not written. And it means that we can deal with the situation in the present day. We are not bound by the limitations of people who draw up a constitution many years ago and assuming that it's going to apply for the present day. So hence, it is ground down in this constitutional business. I personally do not quite understand how, if an Act of Parliament has gone through in Catalunya's favour and it's been signed off by the King, that you could have a constitutional court that overrides that. But that is what actually happens. The difference also is, as I mentioned, this movement within Catalonia. It is street at its bottom going up. I would suggest that in Scotland you have a very, very clever and astute politician, the form of Alex Salmond, who is persuaded the SNP. He's run a very, very good government, succeeding, I should say, what was a very flaccid Labour administration in Scotland for years, which was getting to the point where it was very inefficient, and if you use the word corrupt, I would agree. And he is putting that option on to the Scottish, or offering that option to the Scottish people. It's very interesting. I've had talks with one particular SNP member of Parliament for Westminster, and he says, actually, we've got a problem. He said, I wish that we could get 1.5 million Scots going down Princes Street waving the Seigneur, but that's never going to happen. And that's one of the differences between the two. He says we also have another problem. He said the trouble is, when we're negotiating with the UK government, the problem is the UK government is too reasonable. In the first place, they said, yes, you can have a referendum, when we really weren't expecting that we would. And then we said, I know, let's see if we can try 16-year-olds. And they said, yes, okay, that's fine. And then we said, well, okay, we will organise it. And the UK government said, well, fine, yes, but involve the Electoral Commission in the drawing up of the questions, etc. We're being cut off below the knees in trying to find issues to really engage the Scottish people against the UK government. As I pointed out to him, actually, Scots ran the UK government for years anyway, so that's another issue. And of course, Scottish independence will mean that England will get its independence back as well, because, you know, we lost it in 1707, the same the time as Scotland, with the Act of Union. But my feeling that in Catalunya, unlike Scotland, where there's a lot of practical planning going to what does independence actually mean, my impression of going along to this particular debate, that there's a lot of academic discussion going on about the constitutional side, when in fact there are practical issues, and I listed these out. I said, in fact, you've got to be careful what you wish for, because you have got to decide about your borders. How are you going to protect them? Are you going to have an immigration policy? What is your citizenship policy going to be? Energy supplies, where are you actually going to get these from, bearing in mind that there are electricity exchanges between Catalonia, the rest of Spain, with France, etc. You actually border France. You've got Languedoc-Roussillon. Are you engaging with France to discuss the fact that they will have another country on the border? Andorra, which for years has been having Spain as its border, just down here. Where is Andorra? There. Will suddenly find that it's got Catalonia and not Spain. Are you in touch with them? Are we dealing with issues like the currency? Scotland has got backwards and forwards about this, and of course you've had the comments by Barroso, one of the many presidents of the EU, saying that, that Scotland will have to reapply to join the EU in the case of independence. I think he's on sticky ground, actually, because I don't think there's anything in the Constitution damn constitutions again, constitution of the EU, which would involve expelling people who are effectively members of the European Union now. But these are issues which Catalunya has got to decide. Another one, which will be a very sticky one, is the question of the monarchy. Now, the SNP has said, fine, okay, we will continue with Elizabeth I of Scotland, Elizabeth II. You know, so that's fine. Buckingham Palace, of course, say absolutely zero, and I fully understand that. But there is a lot to play for in Catalonia at the moment. Quite how this referendum is going to go forward, I don't know. I did mention this to a fellow called Joan Laporte, who was the president of Barcelona Football Club. He was here, just a couple of weeks ago, at a dinner given by Catalans UK. Incidentally, that's interesting. Catalans UK is a group of very young, very talented Catalans who are working in the City of London, etc., to the benefit of our economy and unfortunately not to that of Catalonia. But anyway, Joan Laporte came along and spoke at this. He was a member of Parliament, although he's now a leading light in Barcelona City Council. And I said, how is this referendum going to take place? He felt that it will be in the form of the European elections of next May. But at the moment, there is the Constitutional Court. If there is a referendum, it would be deemed by Spain to be illegal. There's very strong resistance in Madrid, and I would say, I discussed this again with a previous ambassador, British ambassador in Spain, who's now retired, and he said to me, you've got to remember, they are still very hard men in Madrid. Officers who are in their 50s in the armed forces now will have had their training as cadets or whatever during Franco's time. Now, are they really committed to democracy? I would question that. A few weeks ago, there was a general called Juan Antonio Chicaro who said, La patria es más importante que la democracia. The fatherland is more important than democracy. And that the role of the armies is to defend the territorial integrity and constitutional order. Now, if that's not a veiled threat, I don't know. I don't know actually what's happened to him. I rather think he was used as a stalking horse, if you like, and the military will know from the reaction of the government as to whether that sort of thing finds favour or not. Hang on. That's an important part. I would say that Catalunya and Scotland's future has ebbed and flowed over the years, and with England's too. And next year, Scotland's destiny, and possibly Catalunya's, could be joined on those events which I have mentioned. Now, if one looks at the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, in my belief, both countries have the right to decide their future, because that UN Covenant says all peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they can freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. Now, if the Spanish Parliament has actually recognised Catalonia as a nation, then it should have the same right to decide yes or no. It doesn't have to be a yes vote. They have the right to decide that. Now, this fell on the floor, but I just want to point that out to you. This, you think, is a tartan. It is a tartan, but it's a Catalan tartan. And it was adopted at the time of the Olympics in 1992. I think it's been forgotten by Catalans. Very few, when I mentioned this to them, because I bought it at a Scottish trade mission during the time, and I was rather taken with it, and with a tie, which I'm wearing as well. And you will see that it in fact reflects the 4 bars of Frederick the Bald's fingers across, using Guifrey el Pelosi's, Wilfrid the Hairy's blood across his shield. And you may not be able to see it here, but these lines are white, representing the snow of the Pyrenees, green, the forests of Catalunya, and they are truly fantastic, and the blue for the Mediterranean Sea. I'm hoping that some bright entrepreneur is going to go to Locharan, because I've been in touch with them and said, would they do another run of these? Yes, they said, if you order 300. I hope that somebody actually takes this, and it might take over from the Burberry or something on the streets of Catalunya, to show solidarity between, and the similarity between Scotland and Catalunya. Thank you very much. Now that was only half. Am I still? Yeah. That was only half an hour. I was told to speak for about 45 minutes. I'm sorry, perhaps I've shortchanged you. I do apologise for that. I should also say a lot of other things too. I mean, pardon? It was an hour? No, I can't even read my watch. I'm so sorry. I do apologise. I'm told that you are allowed 2 or 3 questions. If I can't see anything up here, all I've got is a bright light. So whoever's got their hand up first, can they wait for the microphone and then ask it?
Because we're recording, if you could actually wait for the microphone. There's one up at the top and one here, so put your hand up and we'll speed towards you.
Hi. When I was working in Valladolid a few years ago, there was at that time a sort of significant movement on behalf of several sports federations in Catalunya to be represented separately. And of course that didn't meet with great favour in Madrid, but is that pressure still being applied?
I would think it is. I mean, it's. I'm sure that Catalunya would very much like to have its own international teams in the same way that the United Kingdom has 4. I remember being in Peru actually at the time when Scotland played Peru, and a lot of Peruvian journalists were quite upset that the UK had 4 teams in the World Cup. They were going around asking "Dónde está la embajada de Escocia?" when they came to us. But yes, there is. Sorry, I'm joking, but that's quite a serious point, and it is something they would like to do. But interestingly, I mean, what was it? UEFA has just accepted Gibraltar as a participant in the football against Spain's objections. I very much doubt if Spain would allow Catalunya to have a team in any international event. It does not find favour of them. And in fact, if one goes on, take it a bit further politically, of course, a new country joining the EU has to have unanimity. And I often wonder that if Scotland did become independent, that one of the countries that would object would be Spain. I was speaking, by the way, and I should have said at the very beginning, entirely personally, although I was in the Foreign Office for 40 years, I have no remit from them to talk about it at all. Everything I have said is my own personal view. Another question?
What is your opinion as to why the Basque region pursued their ends with violence and the Catalans did not, or have not? What is the difference? Why should one be so peacefully asking for independence and the other rather the reverse?
Well, I have to say that the Basque Country is a bit out of my area and I don't know it as well. Different temperament. I mean, I've visited the Basque Country. It is a totally different era. Quite why violence, I don't know. But they did go down that path. There was a small terrorist group in Catalunya called Tierra Uri, which a few years ago set off a few bombs, but it didn't get very far. It's just not part of the Catalan nature.
Perhaps just one more?
just wonder if you could say a little bit more about the economic dimension of this question of independence. I mean, I think we see in Scotland how both sides are spinning the different main economic factors, the oil, the public expenditure, banks, so on. What are the main kind of economic factors in the parallel debate in Catalonia?
My fear is that this debate is not actually taking place, that it is absolutely bogged down into the whole issue of, is this our right to do so constitutionally or not? We've got, I say we in the United Kingdom, have got over that barrier and decided that Scotland has the right to decide its own future in a referendum. And therefore those economic issues are being discussed openly in the United Kingdom. My feeling, and Joseph might correct me on this, is that the economic issues are not being discussed in the manner which I believe that they should be. Because as I said on my talk, you have to be, we have this expression in Britain, or in English, you know, be careful what you wish for. And that's one of the issues that they should really be addressing. Do you agree with that? Agreed.
Well, on that harmonious note, I'd like to say thank you very, very much, Geoff, for your illuminating talk. I'm not surprised you thought it was half an hour, because it did whiz by with so many interesting facts.
I see no more there, I thought, as well. But thank you. Do remember, of course, there are 50 flights a day from the United Kingdom to 3 airports, Reus, Barcelona and Girona. 50 flights from all places, although including flights from Bournemouth. You've got the best restaurants in the world in Barcelona. Seriously. You've got El Bulli, which was regarded as the best. That's now closed, and it's been taken over by Can Roca as being the best in the world. It is the most phenomenal place. It goes from the sea to the woods to the mountains. You can bathe at one time and go and ski on the other the next day. Fantastic place. Enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you.